All right. Well, thank you all for joining me for this lightning talk. My name is Adam Bruneau, and I'm a web developer for DASA Technology Services at NC State University. I use he, him, and his as my pronouns, and I'm going to talk to you about extending the WordPress REST API. So our objectives for the next 9.5 minutes, give or take, are to introduce the WordPress REST API, talk about a few methods of extending the API, and why you might want to. With no further ado, let's get started. In order to take advantage of the REST API in WordPress, you need to know the basics of each of these items. Very briefly, representational state transfer, or REST, is a type of application programming interface, or API, that WordPress supports. Data is then exchanged in the JavaScript object notation format. This session will not discuss these concepts further, but I strongly encourage you to do so on your own as necessary. In addition, we'll specifically be discussing development in WordPress and a few code snippets in PHP. In reality, you may need additional experience to use and extend the WordPress REST APIs, but these concepts should be enough to get us through this presentation. And of course, I'm going to be referring to functionality as it's available in 5.4. A quick aside, one thing that I've run into several times, if you're playing in your own environment and the REST API is not responding at all, make sure that you've enabled pretty permalinks. The plain style of permalinks does not seem to be compatible with the API whenever I've tried. All right. The REST API functionality that comes out of the box with WordPress offers all you need to run a headless WordPress instance. That is to say, you can access most of the content you create in WordPress through the existing APIs included in core. There are two namespaces that cover the built-in REST APIs. Those are OEmbed1 and WP-v2 namespaces. Some folks may be familiar with OEmbed. These endpoints give you the data that you need to create an iframe on another site. However, the main namespace you're likely to deal with is WPv2, or the WordPress API version 2. This is where you can retrieve your content, like a post. But wait, you might say, aren't we talking about extending the WordPress REST API? You're just telling me about features of WordPress core. Yes, which brings us to an inescapable fact. The wheel has already been invented. If the data you need is available from one of the existing APIs, there's no need to create your own, and it would be unwise to do so. However, if the data you need is not available from the existing APIs, we'll discuss a few methods to make it available. The simplest way of extending the REST API is using show and rest on existing content. So let's start there. If you have already created a custom content type that is not showing up in the REST API, you can sometimes simply add the show and rest argument when you register the custom content. While adding one attribute is close to the best case scenario in terms of developer workload, be sure to review the REST API handbook for additional steps that you should take to make the endpoint more complete and robust. In this snippet, we use the show and rest argument when registering a custom books post type to make books data available through the REST API. This pattern is well documented in the REST API handbook for working with custom post types and custom taxonomy. After enabling show and rest, when you access the corresponding endpoint for that custom post type, you'll receive a response with your content, in this case, books, in your system. The data will be added to the WPv2 namespace by default. Perhaps we don't want to show custom content, though. Maybe we want to show additional fields on an existing object. For instance, maybe we want to include a URL for the featured image on a post. For this, we'll need to use register REST field. When you register a REST field, the object type can be a post, comment, or other WordPress object, and then the attribute is the name of the attribute on that object that you're registering. The final parameter is an array of arguments that it can optionally include a schema for the data or callback functions to handle get and update requests. Let's take a look at adding the featured image URL to post retrieved through the REST API. We register a field called featured image source on post objects. Then the actual work is done in the get callback function to retrieve the data we need. Once you've completed those steps, you can request posts through the API, and they will now include a new attribute called featured image source that provides a link to the featured image. Simple as that. A word of warning. While it is possible to do so, changing or removing data from the core REST API endpoint responses can break plugins or WordPress core behavior and should be avoided whenever possible. Your code should only create additional fields. It's also worth noting that if you find your requests are returning too much data, you can use the fields parameter on your request to narrow the data returned to just the specific fields you're interested in. Finally, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the most powerful and flexible way to extend the WordPress REST API, register REST route. When you register your own route, the sky's the limit. Or perhaps more accurately, your development time is going to be the main limitation. There will be substantial boilerplate code involved in creating your own endpoint, but essentially, you create your own namespace and route, then define methods to handle different types of requests. I'll stop there for my technical explanation, but know that there's an excellent code sample in the REST API handbook for a starter custom route that includes 254 lines of code with just stub functionality and no real features implemented. That code can be found in the Adding Custom Endpoints section of the handbook. With a custom route, you can do whatever you want. For instance, you could return results of a custom query, enable API-based management of WordPress users, get data from custom tables, provide data for JavaScript-based components, or wrap an external API. These are just a few examples, and I'm going to focus on that last one. Let's imagine we're building a dynamic block that accesses data from an external API using JavaScript in the editor and PHP for the dynamic block render callback. Some of you probably have code that directly accesses the external API like this. It's okay, me too. So why am I calling this an anti-pattern? The main problem is code quality. If the external API changes or breaks, you are at its mercy. Also, this setup will invariably make your code difficult to test. Instead, own your endpoints. When you control the code that brings data into your system and do so at a single point, it gives you the opportunity to massage the data as necessary, or even use a completely different external API without the rest of your code being any the wiser. As an added benefit, your JavaScript code will not have to worry about doing battle with cross-origin resource sharing or CORS. A better setup might look something like this. Instead of accessing the external API directly, you can use your own API to serve the PHP code and your custom REST endpoints. Your code will also be much more testable. I also highly recommend using transients in WordPress to reduce the round trip time for most requests. In my own experience, even for very simple requests, transients are about 3 times faster than direct interactions with an external API. With that, let's talk about a few plugins that extend the REST API. To provide authentication, you will likely want to use something like application passwords to manage their access. Aside from that, many popular plugins feature some sort of REST API functionality. This is not a direct endorsement of any of these plugins, just a list of some popular plugins that do include REST API functionality. And I'm going to wrap up there. If you entered questions in the chat, I'll do my best to answer them if I have time today. Feel free to follow me on Twitter, although I'm not an especially active user yet. Or if you're into the vintage tech, send me an email. Thanks for joining me.